I'm David Blight of the Gilder Learning Center. This is another in our annual Wednesday talks, GLC at lunch. Today we're thrilled to welcome, well, formally welcome him before. Evan Turiano, he's been here for the full semester as a fellow at the Gilder Learning Center. He grew up in Connecticut, went to Trinity College, then on to Queens College, City University of New York, where he was in the honors program, actually taught there in the honors program. And there's a PhD at the Graduate Center, at CUNY Graduate Center in New York City, with his mentor, Jim Oak. Dissertation entitled Secession's Moving Foundation and Fugitive Slave Rendition in Politics of American Slavery. He's writing a book about that infamous Fugitive Slave Act and its impact in the 1850s on this whole world of what Evan calls freedom seekers, fugitive slaves. He's the author of an important article called Prophecies of Loss, debating slave flight during the Virginia Secession Crisis in the Journal of Civil War History. His book in progress, already under contract with LSU, is called The Politics of Fugitive Slave Rendition and Coming of the Civil War. I can say for the one who is often deeply involved in this business of the 1850s, that this is going to be an important book in a kind of new return and move into the study of fugitive slaves and the coming of the war. We're thrilled to have him here. He holds a fellowship named for Walter Evans. Walter Evans, the collector, who, among other things, collected the magnificent Frederick Douglass collection, which is now at the Beinecke. Those of you who haven't heard, you'll hear more later. There will be a kind of celebration and exhibition about that Frederick Douglass collection February 1st, I believe it is, at the Beinecke, and the exhibition will be up for probably 6 months. Walter and his wife Linda will both be here for that. A very special occasion for the Beinecke and for the GLC. We co-sponsored this fellowship, which Walter Evans endowed. So, without further ado, on the perpetual crisis, he's freedom seekers in the coming Civil War. Evan, tell yours. Oh, and I forgot to mention, he's written numerous book reviews, including a review of Ed Rutherford's most recent book, who was here in the room today. So, obviously, it's a good review. Did you forget that?
all nice things. Yeah. I'll finish. Great. Well, thanks, David, for that kind introduction. Thanks to Michelle, Melissa, everyone here at the GLC, David or Daniel for setting this talk up for me. Thanks as well to the Beinecke, to the Gilder Learning Center, to Yale, and to Dr. Walter Evans. Did I have a little situation here? Great. And to Dr. Walter Evans for his generous support of my work. So today I'll provide a summary of the argument chronology of the book that I'm working on here at Yale, talk about some of my early findings, but mostly sort of look forward to all of your questions and comments. So I want to open with this image, which I came across in the course of my research. It is printed on envelopes that somebody would purchase to send mail in, as you can see a little bit better here. Envelopes printed with various images and messages were a common form of ephemera, a place where printers had figured out how to cash in on current events while providing consumers with a new way to communicate political and social messages to their correspondents. They were especially popular during the Civil War, often including patriotic imagery such as the flag, famous Americans such as Washington or Lincoln, or derisive imagery of the Confederate traitors. Others depicted slavery in African Americans, often with racist caricature and anti-emancipation subtext. Sometime during the war, a print shop from Cincinnati produced this envelope in large enough quantities that I've come across 3 different copies in various libraries and collections during the last couple of years. As you can see, it features a Black person's feet and lower legs, barefoot, dirty, toes curled, neither dignified nor elegant. It reads, "The peculiar institution, secession's moving foundation, and tendency due north via Monroe." I struggled for a long time to make sense of this document. It clearly was relevant to me in my work. Here was an argument that the enslaved and their so-called tendency due north were in some way the foundation of the secession movement. It hinted to me as well some connection between fugitivity from slavery before the war and the mass escape that the war enabled. That was the sort of foundation of slavery's demise. But it was and remains quite confusing. I did not know, and still in fact do not really know, whether someone buying and mailing this envelope was meant to celebrate or fear enslaved people's northbound tendencies. Most of all, though, I just struggled with the main bit of text, even as I made it my dissertation's title. Secession's moving foundation is cognitively dissonant in some ways, feels like word salad. There's a nonsensical element to this idea of a moving foundation. At some point, though, I realized that maybe that nonsensicality was the point. The Southern secession movement's very foundation was the enslavement of Black people, their legal and social reduction to saleable property. The Confederacy's president famously called it the cornerstone upon which the new government was built, while a South Carolina senator called it, quote, the very mudsill upon which their society rested. The metaphor of the system of slavery and of 4 million enslaved people themselves as being an architectural foundation was everywhere in the South. But as the sort of purchasers and creators of this envelope knew, they had a real problem with that foundation. It was moving, it was unstable. Enslaved people moved, they fled. And nothing, I think the artist behind this envelope knew, could be built on a moving foundation. This was revealed when the very first wartime freedom seekers made their way to Fort Monroe in May of 1861, and had been revealed over and over again when enslaved people escaped before the war. Southern society, politics, and law, and a significant chunk of the American economy was built on a moving foundation bound to topple. What I hope my book can show is that this problem and the sort of widespread awareness of it did not just emerge with secession or after the passage of the infamous 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. Rather, it hung over any settlement under which free African Americans claimed legal rights at the same time that slaveholders sought a race-based property right at the same time that enslaved people flipped the chains of slavery and made breaks for freedom. In other words, while the conflict developed and evolved significantly over time, it was always a constant, perpetual presence hanging over American slavery, one that I think goes a long way to explaining how pro-slavery and anti-slavery politics became radicalized to the extent that they did by the end of the Civil War. So, my book manuscript looks at the politics of fugitive slave rendition, and more specifically at the contested legal rights of people accused of having escaped from slavery. On one side of that struggle were slaveholders who claimed an absolute property right over accused freedom seekers, and argued that any legal remedies available to Black defendants threatened that right. On the other side sat free African Americans and their allies in the American anti-slavery movement, who asserted that Black people accused of having escaped slavery were due a legal process. This was a vital protection against kidnapping under the pretense of fugitive slave rendition. In addition, though, it became an important component of the anti-slavery political and constitutional project, an important cornerstone of a citizenship claim. The fundamental incompatibility of these two positions revealed in every trial over the status of an African American claimed as a fugitive slave was crucial to the conduct of this war. So with this project, I'm trying to examine the intersection of excellent recent work on the Underground Railroad and on Black politics and citizenship in the early United States. Scholarship on flight from slavery in the last 2 decades has shown us that enslaved people seized freedom by the thousands each year, shaped communities in cities and towns across the North, and became leaders in the anti-slavery movement. John Hope Franklin and Lauren Schweniger's work is a contemporary jumping-off point from which scholars including Cheryl LaRoche, Manisha Sinha, Eric Foner, and especially Richard Blackett have built. Meanwhile, new work on free African Americans' legal and political rights has upended previous notions of who claimed citizenship and what that claim entailed in the early United States. Here I'm drawing again from Professor Sinha, as well as Kate Mazur, Van Gough, Andrew Deemer, Chris Bonner, Sarah Groening-Sater, and others. This just scratches the surface. I'd be happy to talk a little more about the scholarship in question time. But I'm hoping that my look at the struggle over the legal rights of people who are accused of having escaped slavery can highlight the inseparability of these two conflicts in a new way. So now I will hit the main premises of the anti-slavery and pro-slavery positions on the rights due to accused fugitives from slavery and try to get a sense of the legal traditions from which they drew. The movement in favor of legal rights for accused freedom seekers was premised on the argument that the basic legal remedies available to free persons, such as a trial by jury, the right to testify, the right to hire legal counsel to present evidence, or even just the right to a hearing before a judge in your home state or locality, were absolutely crucial to prevent people from being kidnapped into slavery. These procedures were also, though, something more. The right to appear before the legal system as a defendant rather than as missing property became an important cornerstone of claims to citizenship among free African Americans. It was the abolitionist movement eventually came to see a claim that threatened the political and legal structures slaveholders were working hard to build. The American slaveholder position, on the other hand, emanated from a pair of related legal principles, each of which could not coexist with any legal rights for accused fugitives from slavery. The first was their right to property in man. The second legal principle that shaped slaveholder policy on fugitive slave rendition was what was called the right of recaption. The right of recaption was an ancient legal right that they derived from English common law, which many American jurists read through William Blackstone, that was provided to male heads of households that they could claim within the domestic patriarchal household structure. Men could, in the words of Blackstone, quote, lawfully reclaim their property in goods or chattels, but could also reclaim their, quote, wife, child, or servant without obtaining specific legal authority, so long as it, quote, not be in a riotous manner or attended with a breach of peace. In short, enslavers, masters, fathers, and husbands, men with dominant positions in the patriarchal household structure, did not need to resort to law when recovering people who had fled or been taken from them. This was not, it's important to say, automatically the same thing as the property right. The right applied to property that had been taken or fled, like a horse, but also to legally subordinated household members, like a wife, child, or apprentice. All of these people owed varying degrees of service to the male head of household under the law, but he did not own them under that law. Still, the right of recaption, which formed the basis of how some people came to interpret the Constitution's fugitive slave clause, provided a cudgel with which slaveholders could protest any legal interference designed to try the status of a person being claimed as a fugitive slave. By 1820, the right of recaption had taken on a life of its own in American pro-slavery politics. Slaveholders argued that it provided them with an unambiguous legal right to property in human beings. In addition to being about abstract legal concepts, though, my book is fundamentally about how radicals on either side learn to navigate the messy world of American politics. All of these principles and positions prove flexible in the face of changing political circumstances. Black leaders and their allies honed their message in the fight to secure gradual abolition and a degree of legal citizenship within the northern states, but they found a taller task when they began to assert access to legal rights across state lines. They would, at different points, embrace state sovereignty, federal power, legislation, the courts, and eventually popular resistance. The pro-slavery position also evolved significantly over the course of the conflict, modulating to fit political and legal opportunities. At some moment, slaveholders sought to keep the federal government away, believing their property right most secure when the state did not interfere by way of the judicial hearing. As time passed, though, they realized this was no longer enough. Slaveholders sometimes appealed directly to northern state governments for proactive assistance, and eventually tried to use their advantage in the federal government to steer it towards their ends, creating an intrusive federal apparatus that would control fugitive slave rendition. That pursuit would culminate in the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. Along the way, it would also create unsustainable contradictions in the American pro-slavery political project, contradictions that saw them vesting more power in the federal government at the same time that the abolitionist movement was making their grip on national power increasingly uneasy. The contradictions this produced, contradictions that fugitives from slavery forced into being, became altogether unsustainable by the late 1850s. So I start by looking for the origins of the conflict over Black legal rights and fugitive slave rendition policies. From its earliest forms, British North American colonial slave law subtly acknowledged the relationship between Black legal protections and the slaveholders' property right by separating accused fugitive slaves from traditional channels of legal justice at every opportunity. We can see this in a couple of patterns. First, early colonial slave codes developed parallel and distinct legal apparatuses for enslaved people accused of crimes, one that almost always included few or no opportunities to mount a legal defense and often concentrated judicial decision-making in the hands of a few landowners. This 1700 law, for example, created a discrete legal process for Black people accused of murder, manslaughter, burglary, rape, and similar crimes, which employed 2 justices of the peace and 6 prominent freeholders impaneled to try the defendant without due process. In 1702, a similar New York law said the quiet part out loud, as they say, admitting in the opening recital that enslaved people, quote, as the property of Christians, could not be subjected to normal legal processes, quote, without great loss or detriment to their master or mistress. So if that was the first trend, the second is that colonial slave codes typically demarcated escape from bondage as something other than a crime. It was punished, to be sure, but rather than creating a criminal judicial process, laws were passed to incentivize bystanders to capture suspected runaways and to make it easy for supposed slaveholders to retake or just take ownership of those alleged fugitives. This 1739 Delaware law offers an example where the law required that accused runaway white servants have their case judged in a local or county court. It allowed Black people suspected of being fugitives to be, quote, taken up and returned by anyone who would then be owed 5 shillings with reasonable charges from the enslaver. The primary goal of these laws, which were relatively unique in British North America, even among British colonial slave societies, as Ed's book shows, was to privilege the property status that slaveholders were trying to destroy. They clearly believed from this very early stage that any access to a courtroom for accused fugitives from slavery threatened their racially defined property regime. Meanwhile, while this legal regime is being constructed, the nascent abolitionist movement starting in the era of the American Revolution began to recognize the anti-slavery potential of courtroom access for accused freedom seekers. A key first step in this realization was the 1772 Somerset v. Stewart decision at the Court of King's Bench in London. In the interest of time, I won't go into the case in too much detail, but it centered on James Somerset, an enslaved man from Virginia, who upon being brought to London by the imperial official who had purchased him in North America, made a break for freedom. His fate crossed that of British anti-slavery leaders who sought to test a theory about courtroom access and the rights of British subjects. They brought Somerset before the court on a writ of habeas corpus, and the moment that the court agreed to hear that writ, rather than the trover writ, which typically dealt with lost property, they tacitly accepted that Somerset and any enslaved person who sued for freedom in England was a person owed rights which were incompatible with their enslavement. Slaveholders in the North American colonies took from this case the lesson that they had been right to construct a law of slavery that kept freedom seekers far from courts where they could assert their personhood. Abolitionists and free Black people in America saw the case and took from it an understanding that when fighting to shape the new national legal system, opportunities to assert legal processes for accused runaways would be crucial to their cause. What I hope to show with all of this background is that the place where the story of fugitive slave rendition in the United States typically starts, which is with the Constitution and the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law shortly thereafter, were already, in fact, highly contested settlements that carried with them the weight of decades of conflict on the issue. So with that in mind, I should briefly examine each of those settlements. The Constitution's Fugitive Slave Clause employed famously passive voice language. It said that people held to service under the laws of a state could not be emancipated by the fact of escaping into a state that didn't recognize slavery, but instead, quote, shall be delivered up on the claim of the person to whom their labor was allegedly owed. This did not, in spite of what slaveholders asked for in the Constitutional Convention, elaborate who should be doing the delivering up and by what process, even while the parallel clause for fugitive criminals did just that. It was, like all of the slavery clauses in the Constitution, vague enough that everybody could go home and sell it to their ratifying conventions. But right away, it created competing interpretations. Most northern state governments interpreted it as giving them the power to regulate fugitive slave rendition processes, specifically to provide legal rights to accused fugitives in order to prevent kidnapping of free people. Slaveholders, by and large, interpreted it as codifying the unfettered right of recapture throughout the United States. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Law was an attempt to clarify some of those open questions. Under that law, slaveholders or their agents were enabled to, quote, seize and arrest people who they claimed as their fugitives, and then to bring them before a local judge or magistrate. The testimony of the slaveholder was, per the law, proof enough to drag any person into slavery if it passed muster with the judge. Anyone convicted of concealing or harboring a fugitive slave would be fined $500 under the new law. Now, of course, this law was received as a threat and outrage to free African Americans. Would-be slaveholders could execute their own arrests, aka snatch somebody from their homes, and the burden of proof was low and ripe for abuse. Free Black leaders petitioned Congress to address the law's potential for abuse and to call for more extensive legal procedures for accused fugitives. The contents of these petitions, as well as the very act of petitioning Congress at all, amounted to a powerful appeal for Black citizenship in the new United States, one which would reverberate in Congress for decades. Some northern state legislators counted free African Americans as important constituent bases and beat back for every pro-slavery appeal for a stronger fugitive slave law. Southern legislators, on the other hand, saw both the Black petitioners and the call for courtroom rights for alleged runaways as entering wedges for abolition and egalitarianism of the sort that they saw unfolding in France and Saint-Domingue. So while African Americans clearly had much to dread in the 1793 law, slaveholders also found that it didn't line up with their policy goals because it didn't go far enough to restrict Black legal rights. The right of recapture did not go all the way. They still had to find a judge that would process their claim. Northern states still had space to pass personal liberty laws, which elaborated and extended the courtroom rights due to accused runaways. Slaveholders therefore also petitioned Congress at the turn of the century, such as you see on the left here, a petition from a group of slaveholders in Kent County in Maryland's Eastern Shore. They wrote a petition to specifically directed at their legislator, targeting, asking for legislation that would target free Black people, legal ability to secure work, shelter, or generally move freely in northern states. With the help of the staff of the National Archives, I was able to start from this petition and sort of trace it all the way through Maryland party politics to a bill that hit the floor of the U.S. Congress in 1801. The bill failed, but just barely. So these parallel petitions by Black Philadelphians and Eastern Shore slaveholders captures effectively the type of political history that I'm hoping to do. You have two groups of people, an early national Black community and a middling, economically anxious group of rural slaveholders in Kent County, waging a dialectic, ideologically charged conflict that not only influences congressional debates over the fugitive slave law, but also about the nature of rights in the new nation and the limits of belonging, inclusion, and citizenship. You give me the next thing, I think I'm done. Perfect. So this sort of back and forth continued through the next couple of decades. Southern legislators failed to put forth several more fugitive slave bills, failing each time, or rather they put forward several more bills, each of which failed. Black leaders and their allies in the abolitionist movement were positioned to do little more than lobby elected officials to fend off these new bills, to win new state level protections, and to hope to inject some assertions of citizenship status along the way. A crisis of kidnapping in the 1820s proved to them that this was not enough. The historian Richard Bell has written about kidnapping from Philadelphia during this period to great effect. So I would guide anyone looking for more information on his work on the subject. But for this venue, I will just tell one of those stories. Sam Scomp was a 15-year-old boy who early one morning in August 1825 accepted a 25-cent job loading crates at Philadelphia's Navy Yard, in the early hours of one August morning. A member of the boat's crew on which he was working shoved him below deck and forcibly bound him. That ship was the Little John, and its crew were members of an infamous kidnapping ring operated by Paddy Cannon and Joseph Johnson. According to a report by Philadelphia Mayor Joseph Watson, Scomp was one of at least 23 colored persons, principally children, who had been abducted by this gang on the Little John during the spring and summer of 1885. Sam Scomp and two other black boys he was kidnapped with were only rescued after they managed to convince a Mississippi farmer who had intended to purchase them that they were the victims of kidnapping. The three boys made it back to Philadelphia nearly a year after their abduction and gave testimony that contributed to the arrest and conviction of members of the Cannon-Johnson gang, including the man who had first lured Sam Scomp off the street. The vast majority of abductees did not share Scomp's good fortune. Days before he reclaimed freedom, Sam had seen his kidnappers beat another boy from Philadelphia to death. Now, Sam Scomp knew precarious status before he was kidnapped. In fact, the week preceding his abduction had been his first in freedom. He was born into slavery in New Jersey, wrapped up in the complicated gradualism of the state's abolition program. Technically bound as an apprentice until he turned 25, Scomp was traded away from his parents to a man he suspected might illegally sell him out of the state. So he had fled south across the Delaware River into Philadelphia, seeking work on the docks. Ironically, that pursuit very nearly landed him the same fate he had feared in New Jersey. So Sam's two brushes with unfreedom, first as a fugitive from bondage and then as a victim of kidnapping, were different in obvious ways. As a fugitive, he was outside of the law. He could not expect the support of northern courts and could offer no testimony that would put his captor in prison. The opposite was true on every account when he was kidnapped by the Cannon-Johnson gang. The fact that Scomp received the protections he did, given his formerly enslaved status, is testament to the Philadelphia Black community's sustained power. Despite those differences between Sam's two brushes with unfreedom, though, his situation in both instances overlapped significantly. The 1793 law in practice blurred distinctions between freedom, term slavery, and permanent slavery. For all the weaknesses slaveholders had identified and fought against, it meaningfully impeded African American access to the legal protections of citizenship, which cases like this proved were far more than mere abstract principles. What did cases like Sam Scomp's mean for the early abolitionist movement? Many came to believe that state-level action was no longer viable. To secure the rights of the most vulnerable African Americans, leaders in the movement came to believe they needed to expand interstate collaborations and modify national laws, not just local laws. Local laws were of limited utility even when they could be enforced, and even that was often far from guaranteed. About a month ago, working at the Bindkey, I came across this document in an eccentric collection of documents related to slavery in Delaware. It's a pardon from 1829 signed by the governor of Delaware, pardoning a man named James Jones, who had been convicted of kidnapping a black girl named Betsy Martin. No evidence is given of problems with the conviction, suspicion of innocence, or any substantial reason for the pardon. It appears to be a simple exercise of executive power. So leaders in the anti-slavery movement committed themselves to, in the words of one national convention, quote, diminish the evil if it is impossible to destroy the existence of this national crime of kidnapping. A national crime, they knew, would require national solutions, not just local ones, and would require new strategies. So the second half or final portion of my book is devoted to uncovering those new strategies. I argue that the rapid expansion of the national abolition movement in the early 1830s, what some have called the second wave of American abolitionism, or what Manisha Sinha calls interracial mediatism, was founded on the basic lesson of the Somerset decision, that securing legal rights for accused freedom seekers could usher in some key way the end of American slavery. One remarkable thing about the patchwork of ideas that come out of this principle is that they came from people all across the movement. People in and out of formal political power, black and white leaders alike, people with fundamental disagreements about key strategic and philosophical principles. So it was not in any sense a unified program that they put together, but rather an ideological toolbox from which leaders could draw depending on opportunities presented by future crises. I'll be happy to talk more about the positions these abolitionists put forth in question time after my talk, but the gist was this. By consistently asserting the jury trial and due process rights of accused fugitives, and by drawing on the Declaration of Independence's universalist message to do so, they thought they could draw attention to the incompatibility of property and man and the American political system. Do this long enough and attract enough support to the cause, and Southern slaveholders might make good on their long threats to break away from the United States. And if they did so, they would forfeit the Constitution's fugitive slave clause protections. When that happened, one abolitionist asked, quote, by what power would the master recapture his fugitive who had crossed the boundary of the new empire? Now he may hunt him through the whole Confederacy, but after secession, freedom would be the boon of every slave who could swim the Ohio or reach the frontier line of the free republic. Similarly, the pro-slavery position on Black legal rights and fugitive slave rendition developed significantly between 1830 and the 1850s. My work looks at how pro-slavery political thinkers and politicians and jurists shifted from arguing that federal and state governments simply needed to get out of their way when it came to reclaiming runaways, to a position that every level of American government and even the American people themselves were obligated to proactively protect the slaveholders' property right whenever enslaved people fled. They also began to craft a revisionist history, one that erased much of the conflict I've tried to recover in my research. Pro-slavery ideologues argued that expedient fugitive slave rendition must have been a point of consensus at the founding, and that it had never been an issue until the Missouri crisis and the pesky emergence of second wave abolitionism. To quote a joint statement by Southern congressman that John C. Calhoun authored in 1849, the fugitive slave clause was, quote, so satisfactory to the delegates that it was adopted unanimously. He continued, quote, with few exceptions of no great importance, the South had no cause to complain prior to the year 1819, when the Missouri crisis roused up a spirit of discord between the two sections. They also, as they began crafting this sort of alternative history, looked back on the founding to reimagine the right of recapture, which I discussed at the beginning of this talk. You'll recall that American jurists who took William Blackstone as the final word had previously understood it as a domestic right held over movable property as well as over members of the household. As scholars like marriage and the law have shown us, even that may have been stretched. Blackstone's writing on the subject reflected patriarchal desires for control during turbulent times as much as they reflected the actual state of the law. Regardless, by 1820 or so, slaveholders started to read the right of recapture in a whole new way. They argued that the right, as it was secured in the Fugitive Slave Clause, made property in man unambiguously legal and especially protected under the Constitution. Take, for example, John Tyler in 1820, then a congressman from Virginia. Quote, although it would be rather unreasonable to suppose that a constitution should guarantee articles of property by name to those who live under it, our slaves are guaranteed to us by the Fugitive Slave Clause. Tyler invited Northerners to, quote, rail at slavery as much as you please. Per his reading of the Constitution, they had, quote, not only acknowledged our right to this species of property, but had bound themselves to rivet the chains of our slaves. So, as I mentioned previously, pro-slavery politicians, authors, jurists used these revisionist histories to justify an expansive reading of the federal government's power over states and individuals alike to compel the quick and easy return of alleged freedom seekers and to prevent any safeguards against kidnapping from slowing them down. That pursuit culminated in the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. Historians often understand the 1850 law in the short-term concept of the context of the US war with Mexico and the Compromise of 1850, and they often end up seeing it as the starting point of the conflict over fugitive slave rendition. I hope my research can show that it was just as much a point of culmination in an 8-decade struggle. That law is infamous for many reasons. It authorized the expansion of a massive federal slave-catching bureaucracy, marshals to recapture alleged fugitives at slaveholders' behest, and commissioners to quickly process slaveholder claims. It incentivized commissioners to send accused African Americans into slavery. They were paid $10 per claim that ended in a rendition and only $5 if they decided that someone was in fact a free person. All of this came from federal taxpayer dollars. Furthermore, it famously used the posse comitatus doctrine to authorize marshals to force northern bystanders into assistance with slave catching and to criminally charge them if they refused to play the role of slave hunter against their neighbors. All of these points came up in debates over the bill and in the protests it elicited, but one argument came up time and again, often seeming to dominate the debates. A fairly broad coalition of politicians and citizens in the northern states, certainly not just anti-slavery radicals, deeply opposed the law's denial of a jury trial and denial of the right to testify to accused fugitive slaves. For example, Congress received over 600 petitions opposing the 1850 fugitive slave law in the first few months of debates, and over 90% of them specifically opposed the denial of a jury trial. On the flip side, this issue was among the least negotiable for Southern congressmen. At one point, Henry Clay had proposed a jury trial held in the southern state from where the fugitive had allegedly fled and was shot down. A Louisiana congressman described the move as, quote, so contrived that far from remedying the evil of which the South complains, it will most obviously embarrass and obstruct the exercise of her acknowledged rights. Now, what I've hopefully been able to show by this point in both the talk and the book is that this focus on what rights were due to people accused of escaping slavery was not entirely surprising, even as historians have paid relatively little mind. The legal rights of accused freedom seekers was the terrain on which these issues had been fought for decades preceding the 1850 bill, and there was no reason why anything would be different at that juncture. This long view that my work provides can also, I think, cast some new light on the political and street fighting that defined the law and its legacy during the 1850s. Moreover, I hope to try and explain in a new way how the issue came to bear so significantly on the secession crisis, the coming of the Civil War, and the eventual destruction of American slavery. So, what the 1850 law really ended up doing, more than anything, was to shove the insistence that accused fugitives from slavery receive a trial by jury out of the radical shadows and into the mainstream of Northern politics. It's true that only a minority of hardliners called for the 1850 law to be repealed. However, Northern politicians of nearly every stripe, even some like Abraham Lincoln, who had to that point charted a fairly conservative course on anti-slavery politics, demanded that it be amended to include a trial by jury. As this constellation of politicians coalesced into the new Republican Party, this became a standard talking point. Now, when Southern leaders heard this, they heard the echoes of what had been, not a decade or two earlier, the starting point of a radical abolitionist program. This issue greatly inflamed Southern perceptions of the Republican Party's radicalism and led Southerners to see an eventual Republican president as a fundamental threat. After all, the 1850 law had concentrated all of the power over fugitive slave rendition, particularly the staffing of its bureaucracy, in the executive branch. This I think, can go some of the way towards explaining a rational basis for the central place the fugitive slave issue held in the emergent secession movement, even in deep South states where escape was less of an immediate and material threat. From there, to a remarkable degree, the progression of events and reactions closely followed the playbook abolitionist theorists had laid out decades earlier. When Southerners threatened secession, the mainstream Republican line was, as William Jay had predicted decades earlier, that forfeiting the Constitution's fugitive slave clause protections would only make their problem worse. As Lincoln put it in his first inaugural address, fugitives, now only partially surrendered, would not be surrendered at all. Finally, and most crucially in fulfillment of the abolitionist program, enslaved people quickly learned about the shifting political landscape, defining their status and opportunities for mobility, and seized it by the thousands by escaping from bondage towards the United States Army. As W.B. Du Bois, this was rather W.E.B. Du Bois's famous general strike, by which he said the enslaved people of the American South took on, quote, by the same methods that he had used during the period of the fugitive slave. Many pro-slavery unionists in the South had feared this exact fate. To quote one unionist from Virginia's secession convention, "Will not the slave find out? The motive to flee across the line would be increased. There will be no fugitive slave law for his recovery, and he will know it." None of this, of course, is meant to imply the inevitability of the process playing out the way that it did. War over slavery was not inevitable until it came in April 1861. Yet, across this conflict, across more than a century, we see time and again that it proved impossible to reconcile a property right over people who resisted their chains with a fragile claim to citizenship by people whose color marked them for slavery in much of the country. And so in the end, abolition looked like many predicted it would. Despite the slaveholders' best efforts, the right to property in slaves was left profoundly exposed by secession and war. That vulnerability was accompanied by a fragile but present presumption of freedom for Black Americans who appeared before U.S. soldiers. Enslaved people themselves, as they had since the 18th century, forced this sliver of an opportunity open by escaping from the threats. Each component of this sequence, abolitionist theorists, political operators, and enslaved revolutionaries, could not have overthrown American slavery on their own, given the slaveholding class's immense political and economic power in the country. And yet, together, they recognized and capitalized on American slavery's fundamental fragility, what I call the foundation. Thank you.
Can I be seen here? Didn't you just stay there and I'm not on camera?
No, they can hear you.
They can hear me. Okay, good. We got mics in the ceiling now. Mics are up here. Okay. Anyway, great. I'm all over this, so I have lots of questions. I love the 1850s. But I'm gonna open it up to our in-room audience, and then I notice we got questions out on the internet. So who would like to go first? Oh, I don't want to go first. Well, first of all, congratulations on your finds, that Delaware document that just emerged out of, it was a big surprise. It was in some miscellaneous collection.
Yes, yeah, there's this sort of assorted, it's a lot of individual manumissions, maybe like 12 or 13 documents related to Maryland.
Yeah, but isn't that cool? That's why we sit around in archives. And the Philadelphia story, the Navy Yard story, that's not very well known. I mean, is it? I mean, that particular, that's an amazing.
Yeah, again,
I know early kid, 1825. I mean, that's, he flees New Jersey to Philly.
Yeah, again, I owe that one to I'd point. I think the book's called Stolen by Richard Bell. He's written a little more about Sam Scott, but no, I think being able to especially sort of see these stories and see this sort of at least, moment of, in what I think is sort of the most important activist community on this subject, really sort of feeling a crisis at the same moment that it feels like they've sort of spent all of their sort of political opportunities up to that point, at the same moment that they are sort of really starting to appeal, to really sort of change their approach to abolition and securing legal rights, realizing that some of their moderate allies up to that point were of limited utility, because the crisis was so
And there's no more activist free black community than that one in Philadelphia, right? And they were really at it. I just want to give you a chance to reflect a little broader or deeper, whatever, on this key part of your story, which is not just the turn to the second wave of abolitionism, or more immediatism, whatever labels we want to give it. You're showing, as others have led you here, that the fugitive slave issue, especially after the 1850 Act, and then frankly, even with the Dred Scott case, because that's, although not a fugitive slave case, it is a slave on northern soil. And its result, that last thing you had up on one of the slides, this radicalizing of the northern population. Reflect on that a bit more, because this is cruel, and I don't think Americans still don't understand this. We live in an age now where, oh, I don't know, racism is always and everywhere. The abolitionists must have been just as racist as everybody else. Yeah. No, there's a radicalizing process going on in the northern population because they're watching this. It's an old story, as you showed, between the 17th and 18th century. But Americans of two generations have grown up with this. And all of a sudden, after 1850, they're made complicitous of the return of fugitive slaves.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. That, you know, the other sort of slavery and the government, the federal government issues that sort of drove sectionalism were for the typical northerner abstractions in some way, right? Unless they happen to be in Kansas, or otherwise, they were abstractions. It was sort of about hypothetical futures, where fugitive slave rendition and the prospect of it was something that no longer allowed the sort of average white northerner to feel as though, you know, through state level abolition, they had really wiped their hands clean of the national institution. You know, especially the first year or two of the 1850s were marked by several notable cases, especially where people who had escaped slavery decades earlier, Richard Blackett's book shows this well, were claimed or attempted to be claimed under the law. You know, I often, the best estimates we have now put the number of renditions under the law somewhere between like 150 and 300, and whenever
It's under the 1850.
Under the 1850 law, and whenever people ask about that, you know, I say that, you know, to the Southern slaveholder, this, you know, feels like a failure when they know 5,000 people are escaping each year or whatever. But to your typical Northerner, that's a newspaper story every few weeks. For those first few years, it's a couple stories a week. You know, it's an immediate. That's the thing. It has a real purchase, and in some ways this then becomes a story of how Southern slaveholders and pro-slavery politicians, you know, through the power they won through the 3/5 clause, kept kind of getting everything they wanted out of the federal government until they began to overplay their hand.
Right.
And the 1850 was a key moment where we see that happen.
They got everything they wanted until they didn't.
Yes.
I mean, and one other thing, if you would just reflect a bit on this big subject of your mentor's most recent book, there's an anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution evolving with this story. You didn't stop on that much, but that's huge here, isn't it? I mean, when abolitionists of different stripes begin to, and they're inventing a history too, in part. They're making the Constitution anti-slavery in the hands of somebody like William Goodell and others who are the philosophers of this. So there's a ready-made, is there not, constitutional interpretation ready to be plucked by people who want to use it, and boy, do they start using it after that fugitive slave act.
Yeah, no, totally. That's something, as you mentioned, that's it. It probably looms larger in my work than I even talked about here, is the sort of question of constitutional politics being something that, you know, I say people knew back then as, you know, we see today often in sort of the conservative legal movement in the Supreme Court, that telling a compelling story about the founding can be really effective politics.
Pick your
Even
founder, pick your story.
Even more so in the 19th century, and that's something that, that not just, the abolitionists you mentioned learning to sort of, tell a compelling story that will, become saleable in the political mainstream, but also slaveholders doing the same thing. That's how I think of in that same decade this started in the 1820s, what John Tyler was doing in that sort of quotation I showed, is that there are this idea of constitutional exegesis is basically being invented in service of the slavery debate. And existentially married to that, the question of the rights of free African Americans and where they slot into the constitutional compact. And I think the fugitive slave issue is useful in that it shows that those two questions are fundamentally inseparable.
Well, and at least the blood in the 18th, I mean, fugitive slave rescues are violent, people get killed. I mean, this is now part of Americans' political experience.
Yes, absolutely.
Riots, as they're called, there's violent resistance to this. People put their necks on the line to protect fugitive slaves. Anyway, I've talked too much. Anyone else?
Yes.
Edward.
Great topic. I love this 80-year history of the fugitive slave law. 3 questions. Going back to this early colonial era laws, these Act for the Trial of Negroes in Pennsylvania and Delaware. Do those laws make a distinction between slave Black people and free Black people, or do they just use the term Negro to apply across the board?
Typically,
not making that distinction.
That's a great intuition. Typically, they do not. Typically, they use some language like Negroes and mulattoes or something encompassing. Sometimes the language slips over the course of the bill between sort of racialized words and slave, but they do not. And so that's the next step of this. Something else I talked about is after the revolution. At the same time that these laws are sort of being overturned in northern state gradual emancipation, is we see this sort of doubling down of southern laws where the status of being a free Black person is basically becoming impossibilized by these laws, and having that status kind of flattened that way.
So the colonial precedents are denying due process to Black people across the board.
Yes.
And gradual emancipation endows free Black people.
Yes, that a component of much of legislative gradual abolition is to say that Black citizens were tried for crimes. That's a component of each of the gradual abolition laws.
That's interesting. Okay. Secondly, what about the personal liberty laws? What role do they play? Passed by the northern states to obstruct the workings of fugitive slave clause, fugitive slave Act 1793. I think they started in the 40s.
Yeah, well,
They play a role in your study, or
they do, yes, there's a significant wave of them in the 40s. There are a couple of waves of, just for context, these laws that they're called personal liberty laws, which basically their sort of general thing is to sort of define the legal process that is left to the states by the 1793 fugitive slave law, but also to prevent the kidnapping of free Black people under the guise of fugitive slave rendition, and they play a significant role. They're a site of contest that I see, when I want to be able to say that John C. Calhoun's full of it in the Southern Address, being like, oh, we never had a problem reclaiming fugitive slaves. We can see these immense sort of diplomatic crises over personal liberty laws, and those, I think, are really one of the places where I can see again, this thing that I'm really interested in, where kind of the rubber hits the road between activism and politics. Like, they're a place where I'm able to see sort of these grassroots articulations of rights meeting local politics, and then able to see southern state politicians, meeting northern states on the terms, and able to sort of establish the long array of this fight. And those laws, kind of go through waves that sort of reflect the national status of things. That change, as you know, after the Brigg versus Pennsylvania decision, in 1842, but they even have a quite early history. A lot of, I think some people, and I would probably agree that the gradual abolition laws of the northern states included the first personal laws, which were sort of the trying the status of people accused of being fugitives.
Didn't Southerners almost interpret those as northern versions of nullification?
Precisely, that's exactly in many
Northern
of
states
the,
were saying, well, just go and try to enforce this.
yes.
We won't do it.
Yeah, and I think what changes in the 1850s is sort of the Southern language up till that point is to say, oh, radicals in Southern politics have injected this nullification into the political system, and they are the problem that needs to be rooted out. Whereas by 1860, the language has kind of changed to say that, because they've seen that large amounts of the Northern public will not enforce their laws. So it started to say that, these are fundamentally foreign and alien people who don't respect our laws, and that the rot is kind of all the way down as they see it.
You had another one too.
The last one, we read this quote, but you didn't give a date. It almost sounded like a pro-secessionist abolitionism.
Oh,
yes.
Abolitionist saying like just.
was that Garrisonian disunionism?
No, so it was the so it's funny, that was William J. And yeah, that was in maybe 1838 or so, and it was sort of it was very early, and it's sort of like a sort of political abolitionist counterpart to, so as some, I know, Garrison and some of his sort of cohort at various points advocated northern state secessionism to sort of break away from southern slavery. But what Jay was arguing, was this sort of point to say that there were a couple sort of basically, he laid out his argument of the anti-slavery constitution, said here are all the points where it's getting messed up in Washington, D.C., especially in the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. And if we poke and prod on these things, Southerners might make good on the threat of disunion, might leave. He says when they do, they're going to forfeit any of the protections they've won up to this point. And most crucially, he says enslaved people will know it, and they will sort of in mass sort of be the rebellion that undermines slavery. So again, it's one of these things that's hard to make sort of, or rather that I don't want to make too much of, but that ends up to a remarkable degree reflecting sort of the course of events, and also that I think explains why Southerners see the Republican position on the fugitive slave law as being so radical. When they say, oh, this law needs to be amended to include a jury trial, and if you succeed, you lose the fugitive slave clause. They are, they were paying attention, I think, to the political abolitionists. They're hearing those reverberations, and that, I think goes some way towards explaining it.
Isn't it interesting how Southern slaveholders did not interpret these Republicans, and particularly Abraham Lincoln, as the moderate he was supposed to be? Because, in effect, the threat was not moderate.
That's at least it did not have a moderate history. I think it all depends, and that's what I hope the long frame does, is that there's two ways to sort of define moderation. You can put it on you can put it on a scale of its contemporary counterparts, and at that moment, sure, there were people calling for much more radical things than Lincoln had, but when you look at the sort of lineage of the argument, I think it maybe has more radical implications.
You're part of the new, well, I don't do it anymore, but for whatever number of years now, scholars of abolitionism have been moving the chronology back. This is, and it's in your era, in many ways, it's got an older, deeper set of roots. It didn't just begin in 1831 and so on. Really? I mean, isn't that?
Absolutely.
And this issue of fugitive slaves is one way to trace it.
Totally, yeah. No, I think that is totally sort of the move that I came up in. Lots of people have been involved in it, and Interesting Haz's book is sort of a landmark in it, and Paul Polgar's book on the first abolition and its radical implications.
And you and most of Jim Otis' students.
But I think maybe where from where it comes is a recognition that even northern state abolitionism around the revolution, which was sort of once sequestered into its own thing, once it begins to deal with the question of what rights an African American can claim in the United States, of being a state citizen, of having rights recognized before the law, it comes up against what slaveholders are trying to build. From that very moment, you know, those things are incompatible. So it could never really just be the state abolitionism, and fugitives from slavery proved that by sort of crossing territory and bringing clashing laws together.
Scott,
Yeah, I've got one. You've got your two sides here kind of arguing about the position of slavery under a national law. I wonder whether they are thinking, whether you've seen them thinking at all about international law, either in theory or in practice, in terms of appealing to ideas about the place of slavery in the law of nations, like whether someone is assumed to be a slave, just sort of abroad, or whether cases involving like slave ships captured on the high seas or at a port after 1808, and cases involving those, like the Antelope comes to mind in the 1820s, whether those are influencing or this conversation at all, or whether people are appealing to or thinking with stuff kind of beyond just the national sphere.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's, I mean, especially on the anti-slavery side, I would say people are sort of, I'm reminded of, it was William Seward there was sort of a big diplomatic crisis, or I think it was in 1840, maybe the first couple of years of his governorship, there were 3 Black sailors who had were accused of having helped a fugitive escape from Richmond on a ship. The governor of Virginia tried to extradite them. Seward refused. At the same time that he passed, that he signed a jury trial law for accused fugitives. And the Virginia legislature basically tried to shut down commerce between the 2 states until he both repealed the jury trial law and turned in the 3 Black sailors, neither of which he did, but he basically makes a law of nations argument where he says, I can't recognize criminals for something that's not recognized as crime or good law in the civilized states of the world. Both and it's not a new insight for me to say that both slaveholders and the anti-slavery side were very utilitarian when they talked about an expansive federal government versus sort of a loose federation of states that they picked and choose based on what served them, but especially at moments when the abolitionist movement on this issue was sort of using a loose federalism, they sort of treated their states' rights in a law of nations context. It says we have a fundamental, our sovereignty is rooted in our ability to protect the people that we define as our citizens. And we can't do that without providing a jury trial and legal remedies when they're accused of escaping slavery. The other place the international context comes is that Southerners understand it as an unfriendly one, that the fugitive escaping to Canada was a worst case scenario as they saw it. And so comes secession time when there are pro-slavery unionists, people warning that should the Southern states secede, they're going to lose the fugitive slave clause. Time and again, they use the Canada metaphor. They say it's going to bring Canada to our very doors. The Canadian border is going to be on Virginia's border. They say things like that.
which meant Britain.
Yes, exactly. That's the thing. Yeah, it meant
Britain will be back.
Yeah, it meant Somerset's. It meant sort of Somerset's precedent on their very door.
Yeah.
Is how they understood it right up to 1861.
Yeah,
We have one
go ahead.
online question, just a very sort of basic question. If you could say more about how slaveholders were able to locate fugitives that they claimed ownership of.
Sure, yeah, so I mean, the first thing I'll say is that they had a really hard time doing so. That's sort of the general, and again, this goes to.
They wanted help.
Yeah, so this goes to lessons, maybe I guess 25 years ago that John Hope Franklin and Lauren Schwenninger taught us, but that the basic sort of story for someone who escaped from slavery was that, getting out of your local municipal context was immensely difficult and the odds were deeply against you, you know, that's a whole different story than what I'm telling that other scholars are working on is the way that slaveholders succeeded in building these local governments and state governments that, you know, really protected their property right. But that when a fugitive from slavery made it into the North Bay, the odds sort of swung into their favor. To the extent that slaveholders were able to recapture fugitives, they it's one of the reasons that many sort of obsessively kept tabs on the kin networks of enslaved people. So, you know, oftentimes you'll see it's because they know that an enslaved person has family or has a spouse or has some connection to a particular place. As you know, many people know, a small cottage industry crops up around fugitive slave renditions, slave catchers working particularly in urban centers like New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Washington. Yeah, so those would be the couple of the sort of couple of things that I would say, and that it would take a stroke of luck, or sort of the reliance on a network and that actually having people they could put into their employ, being federal marshals and stuff
They
like
need
that.
money.
Absolutely, it cost a tremendous amount of money, and that it wasn't even reclaiming somebody they claimed as a fugitive was not even the first step, and they had to get them before a judge, you know, in the late 1840s, before the creation of the 1850 law, sometimes there was just one federal circuit judge in a state that needed to hear the case. And so there's a reason why they wanted to export all of this onto the taxpayer.
And runaway slave ads are such a great source for historians, but how effective were they for the slaveholders?
That's a great question. I don't know that anyone's ever sort of systematically tried to, you know, we have anecdotes.
Hard to measure that. I mean, it's fascinating.
It'd be a very hard thing to measure, and I mean, people are doing great data projects. That's a great question. I really don't know. And again, I suspect that it follows the same pattern, that they're much more effective when they are quick and local. Rather than when you're sort of picking one into the Philadelphia Daily Advertiser with hopes that you're landing in the right place months later.
We have these successful stories of recapture. The Anthony Burns case, the famous case in Boston, the extent his owner went to find him. And then got him back to Virginia, and Ellis was bought his freedom here. But there were other stories.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, unless we hear more from the audience, to hear you reflect generally as a final question on the age-old chestnut of, you've used the word incompatible here many times. These are incompatible legal positions. They're incompatible constitutional positions. The Fifth Amendment is itself a brutal contradiction. It's got the right to property and the privileges and immunities. It's got due process and the right to property in the same amendment. So the Civil War is inevitable. Yes, no, because of this. Does this give us at least one thread of that story to, exactly when war is inevitable is always another question. But the incompatibility in the Constitution itself of this makes a conflict.
So
I don't know how
you won't get me on camera saying that the whole world is inevitable. I'll tell you that.
This question.
Yeah, what I will say, and this is something that I've always stressed to my students, is that if you're someone, as I am, who's like deeply interested in the boundaries of citizenship, the boundaries of inclusion in the American political compact, as was like so ill-defined at the founding, it's crucial, and this isn't my original insight, but I think it's one important here. It's crucial that we look at that stuff is messiest at the boundaries. It's messiest for African Americans, for women, for immigrants, for people who were sort of testing and establishing, when they were sort of testing and fighting for inclusion in the American body politic. It was it's not just an important story for their story, but for the sort of definition of membership in the American Constitutional Compact. And so What I will say is that these sort of definitions and sort of strong political case for inclusion that free African Americans put forth from the 18th century, put forth constitutions that, or put forth contradictions that were sort of unsolvable with the Constitution being constituted as it was. Whether that inevitably had to lead to war, I don't know. A lot of that then depends on the really deeply seated power slaveholders did have in the federal government. It depended on people imbuing the Constitution with meaning, right? It doesn't necessarily, that's where constitutional politics is important. It doesn't necessarily have to mean anything that the Constitution contradicts itself, or it's a piece of paper sitting. But yeah, so yes, the contradiction, there was no, and that's what I think I really see in the debates over the 1850 fugitive slave laws, that you see that every third way out of the problem appears to everybody involved to have been tried.
Yeah.
And so whether that's an argument about inevitability or not, I don't know.
Right. Right. What we can be sure of is that without this history, it's impossible to even imagine the kind of civil rights regimes that we live under today, as vulnerable as they are. You know, if this hadn't happened, we can't even have. Anyway, any final comments or suggestions for Evan Zeppel that we haven't written for you? Well, Evan, I think this is brilliant, and we can talk about this forever. Thank you, and thank you to our audience out online, and